We are delighted to welcome Professor Keynes to come speak to us about financial instability and the causes of economic crisis, as well as some of the quite gaping holes in neoclassical economics. Professor Keynes is one of the first economists to predict the last recession, is very well qualified to speak on such matters, and I encourage you all to thank him for coming today.
Thank you. Well, since I'm in the college that Keynes was educated in, I tried to promote Keynes's analysis and argue that it's very, very different to what you learned was probably your most famous student. I'm sure somebody can dispute that for me in terms of his fame, but from my point of view, the most famous student. This is, on the left-hand side, you'll see the way in which I predominantly support myself these days. I'm mainly funded by crowdfunding now. A whole range of reasons behind that, mainly very sceptical about the nature of modern universities. I'm happy to discuss that as part of the questioning as well. And my two books and one cartoon book. So Debunking Economics, which I wrote really to assist people who did not believe mainstream economic theory but did not know why. So explaining an enormous literature which is normally left out of mainstream education. The second one, which is the main point that was raised in my introduction here, what causes financial crises? This one is, can we avoid another one? And the final one is a bit of a laugh. I wrote the papers that led to this as speeches at a number of conferences, and I have a cartoonist. As you can see, I didn't do the cartoons. I can't draw to save my life, but I have a classical Marvel Comics cartoonist doing the cartoons for me. And this is a set of cartoon satires of economics called Econ Comics, taking the con out of economics. But what I want to talk about today is starting with talking about how did we go from Smith's concept of the invisible hand, that I'm sure you're all familiar with, to where a modern economic theory is. And if you look at Smith, the invisible hand statement was actually the phrase was used by Smith on several occasions, only once in The Wealth of Nations. And what he was using it was to argue that manufacturers would not move production offshore from England or from the UK, Smith writing in Scotland, would not move offshore to take advantage of lower wages overseas because of their sense of patriotism. That was the context of it. Nothing like the way the context is actually talked about in economic theory. So most economists have not read the original and don't know this is the context in which Smith actually made this statement. But he talks down the bottom, led as if by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. In other words, the person's expectations about what would happen were completely different to what actually happened, but what actually happened was better than what the person intended. So there's a way in which Smith is saying that a market is something which achieves a better outcome than people themselves are intending to achieve for society. And that goes against the expectation people have. Now, that is a vision of a system which leads to outcomes that are different to what individuals want from that system, but better than those people themselves are trying to achieve for society as a whole. Self-interest leading to a positive outcome for society. By the time Keynes comes along, 150-something years later, we have an economic theory which he satirised in the following way, and criticising what he called classical economics. We would today call what Keynes called classical, we would call neoclassical, based on the work of Marshall and Walras and Jevons. And he wrote about this theory at the time he was developing an alternative and said, I accuse the classical economic theory of being itself one of those pretty polite techniques which tries to deal with the present by abstracting from the fact that we know very little about the future. So there's a sense of uncertainty about the future in what Keynes is writing and saying the conventional theory, whom I'm attacking, whom I'm criticising while I'm writing the general theory, they pretend that they can ignore the future. Now, things have got worse again from when Keynes wrote because, have you heard of the name Debreu? You will hear Debreu if you do economics at Cambridge or Oxford in the next few years, and exalted, a Nobel Prize winner, won the prize for mathematical economics. His book Theory of Value is seen as setting the foundation for how economists think about a modern economy. And this is again, I don't think many economists actually read the original to see how simply absurd the claims being made in this theory are. And this is de Breuer talking about a production plan. And so production is classified as possible or impossible based on the present knowledge that this person has about future technology. Of course, what do you have at the moment about knowledge about future technology? Not quite zero. We can extrapolate some of the technology we see today and say they may be the technologies of the future. This is the assumption de Breuer made. Quote unquote, the certainty assumption implies that he, the producer, knows what input-output combinations will be possible in the future, although he may not know the details of the technical processes that will make them possible. So an essential part of his thinking about how do we handle the future is imagining that we know the input-output elements for future technologies without knowing what those technologies might be. And then he handles uncertainty. So how does he handle uncertainty? He defines a commodity in such a way that you obtain a theory of uncertainty, first of all, which is free of any probability concept, and secondly, is formally identical with the theory of certainty that he developed in previous chapters. Now, that is not acknowledging uncertainty, that is abolishing it. But that became seen as what the mainstream economic theory should be based upon. So a large part of economic theory is quite mythical about how they handle the future. And another example, when you get to university, you will probably hear what's called the Lucas critique. And the Lucas critique is seen as a major demolition job on conventional economic modelling of the time, which used large-scale equation models to predict where the economy might go based on econometric trends in different industries and so on. Now, that particular critique, there's some merit to the critique that Lucas put forward in that paper. But also in this paper, he talked about how people form expectations. And he did not like the way that Milton Friedman described expectations as being formed, because what this implied was people learnt by experience and adapted their learning by experience. And Milton Friedman used that as an argument against Keynesian economic policies. But part of what was implied was that if you were willing to tolerate a higher and higher level of inflation, you could drive the unemployment rate below what Milton Friedman called the natural rate. Now, Lucas said that he believed that that was inadequate because the natural rate hypothesis fundamentally said the government can do nothing to change the level of economic activity. And he said one part of the adaptive expectation was rejected because it implied that there could be a difference between what inflation would actually turn out to be in the future and what people's expectations of inflation were for that future date. And he said one element of the natural rate hypothesis is that this has to be zero. So how do we reach the result that people's predictions of the future rate of inflation will be precisely accurate? He said, well, since if we need that to be zero, we can simply add the assumption that it is zero as an axiom. In other words, we can assume people accurately predict the future rate of inflation. Now, that is so baldly insane that there's a next paragraph. He says, or we assume expectations are rational in the sense of Muth. I'll let you find out where Muth fits into the story. But what he's saying fundamentally is that rational expectations is equivalent to believing people can accurately predict the future. So the word rational, the way it's defined in economic theory, if you were shown that definition without the word itself and asked to choose what word in the dictionary fits this definition, you would choose prophecy. So what is called rational expectations is actually the capacity for accurate prophecy. I think it's fairly obvious economists don't have that. But that's what they fool themselves they did have in the models that were built before the financial crisis. Now, after the financial crisis, some hand-wringing has occurred. There certainly is not overwhelming rejection of those methods. But I do like this particular paper written back in 2010, talking about the macroeconomics completely failing to see the financial crisis coming and how do we deal with what they're doing. And he talks about the pretense of knowledge. And what he points out is the development process that has occurred in economic theory has been a gradual series of steps leading from a couple of compromises to handle things you don't necessarily understand, but you make what looks like, you call it a simplifying assumption, to get over that problem. And each incremental step has led us further and further away from reality. So he concludes that these iterative processes, tiny steps where each person makes a little contribution to handling a problem that can't really be solved in the mathematics, gets to the point where you make make-believe substitutions time and time again, and you end up believing that the market works because everybody in the market is God or Nostradamus. Now that's completely different to Smith. I started with Smith's statement saying that people have expectations that are not fulfilled. And the market works because it actually brings those unexpected outcomes together and brings a socially beneficial outcome, which is not the same that anybody in that system actually wanted to achieve. But modern macroeconomics only works because they presume everybody rationally expects the future, meaning accurately expects the future, accurately predicts it, in which case, why do you need a market? It's actually a non-market theory of economics. And one thing, have any of you seen what's called the Keynes Hayek Rap on YouTube? I see some nodding heads here. That actually does a very good job. I'm actually quite impressed with the script writing behind that because it does capture the large contrast between Keynes and Hayek. But in one way that it's not captured by conventional understanding of Keynes, he and Hayek were very similar. I started with a quote with Keynes saying that we have classical theory pretending that it can talk about the present by abstracting from the fact that it knows very little about the future. So uncertainty about the future was a very powerful thing in Keynes's writings, equally in Hayek's. And on this front, you could look at the two and not know who wrote the paragraphs. But here, Hayek is saying the market works by aggregating tiny amounts of knowledge to reach a better outcome than any central planner could achieve. And again, it's uncertainty, the complexity of the system makes it impossible to understand what's going on. So my feeling is the economics almost everybody in this room is going to be exposed to has been built by that incremental process I showed you a short while ago into something which is technically extremely challenging, very difficult to do. Because it's difficult, it feels like science. It feels like mathematics. But I actually describe what conventional economics does as not mathematics, but mythematics. There's an outcome they're trying to reach of proving the market reaches equilibrium and proving it can get there without intergovernment intervention, proving that that's a beneficial outcome. And each step along the way in trying to prove those results, they reach the mathematical conundrum. So the very first major mathematical conundrum in economics concerned what's called Walras, and Walras' theory of atonement as a model of how markets reach equilibrium. And what Walras imagined is a room rather like this, where everybody comes into one place and wants to trade, and you all have different commodities, so you have a certain stock of commodities, you all have different tastes. There's somebody down the front called an auctioneer. An auctioneer calls out a random set of prices, and those random set of prices mean that some markets are in equilibrium, supply and demand is equal in that market, others demand is greater than supply, other supply is less than demand. All you know is what you possess, what your tastes are, and what the prices are. That's all the information you have. It's actually a small amount of information, a huge amount in some ways, but nothing like a capacity to predict the future. And Walras imagined that you could have that, first of all, random set of prices called out, markets with a price, with an outcome where demand was greater than supply, he'd increase the price. Markets where the supply was greater than demand, you'd drop the price. And he believed that process of groping, as he called it, which is the translation of tâtonnement. I hope some French students can tell me how close I am on that front. But tâtonnement means groping. Groping towards equilibrium. He thought you'd ultimately converge to that point because in the markets where, in each individual market, if demand was greater than supply in that particular market, that meant that the price was too low. So you'd increase the price and necessarily for that market, you'd push it towards equilibrium. But that would then affect all the other markets. Demand would go up and down in some of the markets, given what you did to bring equilibrium in that individual market. And what Walras thought was all the stuff that's the effect of the direct effects, changing the market price in an individual market to bring it close to equilibrium, they're all in the correct direction. But the ones off, if you imagine like a matrix, a square matrix of demand and supplies, all the ones on the diagonal, what you did on the diagonal would necessarily move the diagonal towards equilibrium. And then he thought the off-diagonal stuff, some would be up, some you'd destabilise, others you'd stabilise. You'd push them further away, you'd push them closer. So he thought overall they would cancel out and what happened on the diagonal would dominate. And that's a reasonable intuition. Now he approached the world's leading mathematician at the time, a man called Henri Poincaré. Poincaré is the person who gave us chaos theory, explaining that the orbits of the planets are actually chaotic in 1899. And Poincaré, who was one of the world's greatest mathematicians, was asked by Walras, will you endorse my hunch that this process will converge? And Poincaré refused. He wasn't willing to say that was just too complex a problem. It was solved about 30 or 40 years later by two mathematicians who were simply trying to solve a problem in pure mathematics called working out what's called the dominant eigenvalue of an array of numbers which are either 0 or greater than 0. And they worked out that what's called the eigenvalue of that matrix is the biggest one is necessarily greater than 0. Now that's a result in pure mathematics. When applied to economic theory, it meant that determinant is not stable. That groping process will not reach equilibrium. Now, the sensible result of that, the sensible reaction would have been the same reaction that ultimately Pythagorean mathematicians had to learning that there were such things as irrational numbers. You all know, do you know the proof by contradiction? Has anybody done that? Okay. That was solved by proof by contradiction by a very unfortunate individual, whose name I can't quite recall right now. You can find his skeleton on the bottom of the Mediterranean. He solved the value of the square root of 5 using a process of geometry with pentagons. And he made the mistake of solving it on a boat in the middle of the Mediterranean with members of the Pythagorean sect. And what he proved was the ratios don't converge. If you draw one pentagon and then you join all the points together, you get another pentagon, and then another and another and another. And he proved the numbers never converge, which proves that the ratio of the sides, the elements of a pentagon, could not be described as a ratio of two integers, when one fundamental belief of the Pythagorean sect was that all numbers are the ratios of two integers. They literally threw him overboard, so far as we understand, and he drowned. But they ultimately accepted there were irrational numbers, which led to the idea of solving quadratics, and then we got complex numbers, which solve quadratics that don't have a real solution, which led to electrical engineering, which led to the world we're living in now. Even though this looks like a Greek temple, we've got electric light here. All this came out of the Pythagoreans realising they were wrong, and finally dealing with it by accepting that there are irrational numbers, and then on goes the progress of mathematics. What economics has done instead is say we don't like that result. How can we get around it? And then that leads to another result, which has the same outcome. How do we get around the fact that it didn't reach the result we want? So, for example, one of Keynes's proteges in the 1920s, a very young man, Ramsey, died before he turned 30, solved a problem about the optimal rate of accumulation investment, he called the optimal rate of saving for a society. The equilibrium of that system was unstable and could not even be solved symbolically. But he said, that's okay, I'm working out effectively what a social planet could impose upon a society. That model is now the basis of modern macroeconomic models, which are called DSGE, which stands for Dynamic Stochastic General Equilibrium Models. They actually have an unstable equilibrium. Now, do you think that's what Ramsey wanted to find? He again would have liked to find that society would converge to this equilibrium path, regardless of where it started. Instead, what he found was the equilibrium in the future was shaped like a saddle. And imagine you're trying to throw a ball bearing to land on a saddle and stay on the saddle. The only way you can do that is by standing directly in line with the horse, throwing the ball bearing so it lands on the up and down section of the saddle and doesn't fall off the sides. What are the odds of that? 0. But that's an essential part of the modern model to explain economic cycles. Now, it's incredibly complicated. It takes huge mathematical processing power to solve a numerical system which cannot be solved symbolically. That's what DSGE models do. It's all nonsense. It's all trying to escape the conclusion that capitalism does not reach equilibrium. Now, this is also a bizarre outcome because what's so great about equilibrium? Equilibrium means no change. And capitalism, if it's characterised by anything, is dramatic change. This piece of technology I'm holding here to advance my slides or focus in on some text at some point was developed because somebody saw an opportunity in the market, which only comes because of disequilibrium. And equilibrium is a state of rest. Imagine you're trying to model a robot. How does a robot move? When the very first robot engineers attempted to build a robot that walked, their thought was, we want to make sure it doesn't fall over. So they wanted to make sure at all times, as the robot took a step, the centre of gravity was between the 2 feet, so it wouldn't fall over. And this is what the robot did. They finally realised the only way you can model the robot actually walking is it's in disequilibrium. If you imagine when you take a step, you are falling. You stop your fall with another foot, and then you walk forward. Once they threw away the concept of the robot being in equilibrium, they could model walking. Now, economists, unfortunately, have become obsessed with the concept of equilibrium. And that, to me, is the main flaw in economic theory. They don't want to have anything happening out of equilibrium, but everything happens out of equilibrium. Now, I can understand Jevons and Walras and Marshall making the decision to model as if we're in equilibrium, because in those days all they had was pen and paper. You couldn't model the dynamic processes that actually happen in the real world in the way we can now with computer software. So what has happened is economics has remained stuck in a time warp, quite literally, warping time, of thinking about the world as if it's always in equilibrium. And I have been trying to get them to consider that non-equilibrium is the way the economy operates. So I want to quickly show you some software that I've developed on that front that I call Minsky in honour of Hyman Minsky. And then what I'll show is Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, done simply by taking macroeconomic definitions and dynamising them. So if you imagine taking the definition for the level of private debt, that is the level of debt divided by GDP, that ratio. Take the definition for the wages share of GDP, that's the wage bill divided by GDP. Take the definition of the employment rate, that's how many people have a job divided by the population. That's what those equations show. Now, if I simulate this model, I'm now using what's called system dynamics. And frankly, if you want to do economics and make a contribution to humanity, I'd advise you not doing economics and studying system dynamics instead. This is technology developed by engineers about 50 or 60 years ago to model out of equilibrium processes, because engineers have to do that. Even a bridge is modelled as an out of equilibrium process. They model it using computer software that handles dynamic equations and simulates them quite effectively. So this is a model just using those 3 definitions. And you can see it's converging to equilibrium, which is great. That's what the economists think happens to the economy. They don't model in this dynamic sense, but that's what their vision of the economy converging to equilibrium is occurring in this model. But if I increase the number that I use to represent how willing capitalists are to invest and make it a larger number, which you would actually think is a desirable situation, this is what comes out of this model. Now notice the cycles are diminishing, same as I showed you beforehand. Only they don't keep on diminishing. They expand, and ultimately the system will break down. This is called a complex system. Now, it's not all that complex. If I show you the equations that are involved in this model, it's literally just those last 3 equations. And there are 3 variables and about 7 parameters in those equations. So it's an incredibly simple model. But what is actually going on is out of equilibrium, one variable multiplicatively interacts with another. So again, it's rather hard to see these equations with the scale of the models at the moment, so I'll make it a bit larger. So what I have here, for example, is the profit share which involves the wages share of GDP being multiplied by the debt level. Very simple, it's very simple nonlinear interaction. The employment rate multiplied by the wages share. It's effectively a quasi-quadratic. What that means is what happens near the equilibrium is not the same as what happens further away. So the system can appear to converge towards the equilibrium and then diverge later. And this is a very common element in real-world systems. Have you heard of what's called the butterfly effect? You heard that expression? Okay. That was the first time that chaos was developed in a modern computer model. And this is a model developed by a meteorologist who realised that the way meteorologists were modelling the climate in the early 1960s was using linear models of the weather dynamics. A times X plus B times Y, etc., linear models. He said, we know the main things that happen in the weather system are non-linear. The wind level interacts with the moisture level and so on. Things are multiplied together. So he took what are called the Navier-Stokes equations, the particular form of equations of fluid dynamics, which are extremely complicated equations, 11-dimensional partial differential equations, and reduced them by what's called the Taylor series expansion to a very simple set of three equations and three variables and three unknowns. Now, you'd never imagine that anything interesting could come out of a model that simply has three variables and three unknowns. Again, just showing the equations in this particular model. They're incredibly simple. The rate of change of x is a times y minus x. The rate of change of y is x multiplied by b minus z minus y. The rate of change of z is x times y minus c times z. You can say it that quickly, it can't be interesting. But it is. Because when you simulate this model, you get a system that is always out of equilibrium. There are three equilibria there, they're all unstable. Two repel in a cyclical fashion and then attract in a linear way. Another one repels in two and attracts in one. The outcome is that all three are unstable, and the equilibrium is where the system will never be. Now, when this was developed in 1963, meteorologists said, that's cool, that's interesting. Obviously, we've got to do nonlinear modelling, and the systems you look at in the weather today are great-great-grandchildren of this particular approach. And that's why, even though the climate has got much more complicated, our forecasts of the weather are far more accurate than they used to be. Because meteorologists were happy to embrace non-linearity, non-equilibrium. Because economists haven't done it, we're stuck with a world where we simply can't see these things coming until they hit us in the face. And that's what happened with the financial crisis. So I want to quickly show you with another software package I've developed, which is not yet commercially released, but it will be at some point, what caused the financial crisis. And it's things which are completely ignored by mainstream economists. So what I've got here is a database of private debt stored by the Bank of International Settlements for 43 countries around the world for the last 50 years, with debt broken down by households, corporates and so on. And what I'm bringing down here is GDP. And I can now look at the level of debt to GDP, which conventional economic theory ignores completely. It focuses upon the level of government debt. That's what mainstream economists obsess about. They're worried about deficits and so on. The school of thought that I come from, which is called post-Keynesian, there's also a group called modern monetary theory, and I support a lot of what their arguments are, though not all. And I can now take a look at the level of private debt to GDP for a range of countries in the world. So let's just do that. That's a bug in the software. I'll try a second graph and hope this one doesn't die on me. Let's see. Okay. Well, let's make this a bit bigger. And what I'm going to do is take a look at total private sector debt in domestic currency for the United States. And what you can see is that private debt in the United States began at 60% of GDP back in the 1950s, reached 170% of GDP, and has since fallen. Now, looking at that data, two mainstream economists concluded that credit plays no role in macroeconomics because people use a financial explanation for the financial crisis. In other words, they rejected because they said if you look at the level of credit, and that's what this is defined as or called in the database, it was very high before the crisis, rose and fell afterwards, but it's still pretty high. So you can't say that that actually caused the problem. But this shows how little economists know about money, which is ironic because most people think economists must be experts on money because that's what economics is about. But you would have been taught, those of you who've done economics, what's called the money illusion. Have you heard that expression? Anybody who believes absolute prices matter is suffering from money illusion. So they don't actually study money. The macroeconomic models leave money out completely. And they certainly leave out private debt. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the annual change in private debt, which I define as credit. That's the correct definition of credit. And if I now graph that as well, what does it tell me about what happened in 2007, 2008? And what you find is that there was an enormous plunge in credit from 15% of GDP before the crisis began to minus 6%. That's what triggered the crisis. And that book I showed you beforehand, the title of Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? I apply that same analysis to numerous countries in the world. Well, let's take a look at a couple of others we know that had a huge crisis. For example, Spain. I'll just use my arrow key to get there. Okay, that's Spain. It went from having credit of 35% of GDP to minus 15% over a short period of time. That's another one of the countries with a crisis. Portugal had a similar experience. What about the UK? You had a much more volatile experience, but you also had a plunge into negative credit when the crisis hit. What about the countries that avoided a crisis, like, for example, my home country of Australia? I've just changed. That's what's called a bug. I hope I can get through it. Let's see. Okay, there's Australia. Australia avoided the crisis because it avoided negative credit. So the countries that managed not to have a crisis back then, including, for example, China. Let's take a look at China. China borrowed its way out of the financial crisis. China's private debt was running at about 120% of GDP before the crisis hit. Their economy collapsed because of the collapse of export sales when the crisis hit. At that point, they initiated the biggest private debt bubble in human history, with credit in 1 year being almost 40% of GDP. Now, everything I've said to you so far would be rejected by a mainstream economist because, according to their theory, money plays no role in macroeconomics. So I want to show why that's wrong. I'm going to go back to my other software package. And the reason I designed Minsky was not because of making models like this, because there are numerous programs that can run simulations like I've shown you for the Renz's model there. What can't be done in those models is model the financial sector. So I'm just being very embarrassed here is finding that, there we are, that's one I wanted. Okay. What Minsky adds is the capacity to model financial flows. So what I've done here is take a model that belongs to Paul Krugman. You've all heard of Paul Krugman? Okay. And Krugman is somebody who argues that banks are what they call intermediaries. Banks are simply introduction agencies who introduce people who save money to those who want to borrow money. And they charge a fee for the service. That's their vision of banking. So I built that model in my software package, which is much more dynamic than what Krugman did his modelling in. And what I'm showing is a consumer sector lending to an investment sector, being paid interest for doing it, paying a fee to the bank for introducing the two sectors, and then all the wage and consumption dynamics down the bottom. And if I simulate this model, I get the outcome the mainstream expects, that money doesn't matter. I can vary. You can notice the GDP is flatlining here. No change in nominal GDP because there's no change in the money supply. I can increase the rate of lending and slow down how fast people repay debt to cause that level of debt to explode. There's a huge increase in the debt ratio in the model, but nothing happens to GDP worth noting. And if you go in the reverse direction, so banks lend more slowly and people repay their debt more rapidly, again, the debt ratio falls and nothing much happens to the economy. Now, for about 50 years, a group of non-orthodox economists, of whom I'm one of the current generation, have been arguing banks are not introduction agencies. Banks originate money and debt. Banks don't lend people's savings to you. They create an asset for themselves called a loan, and they create an identical liability for themselves, which goes into your deposit account, which you then spend. And they're exactly equal to each other because you'd never go to a bank and the bank would say, that's a great idea, here's $1 million, and by the way, you owe us $1,001,001. Okay, you say, no, you lend me $1 million, I owe you $1 million. So they're precisely equal. And by creating the asset on one side, they create the liability on the other, which you then spend. So that credit gets spent into the economy. So I can rapidly show this by going inside this mythical model with Minsky, and this is not possible in any other software package. I'll just make it larger so you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to delete the debt being shown as an asset of the consumer sector, because it's actually an asset of the banking sector. And I'm going to delete the mythical financial transactions between the investment sector and the consumer sector and come across to the bank's view and create an extra column for assets now. And since somebody's asset is somebody else's liability, the debt is still sitting in there as a liability of the investment sector. So I can tell Minsky to go looking for any liabilities that haven't been allocated as an asset to anybody else. And it brings across those operations. And to make it complete, all I have to do is say, well, the interest payments are actually made to the bank, and let's get rid of the bank fee. Now, there's a couple other changes I should make to make the model more completely coherent, but having done that, I'll go back to the same initial conditions I showed you for the other model. So debts double roughly every 7 years and repayment halves debt roughly every 9 years. And now simulate the model, and you'll notice several changes immediately. For a start, GDP is growing. Secondly, the increase in the level of debt is causing an identical increase in the amount of money. If I now increase the rate of lending, the economy goes into a boom. If you then have a slowdown in the rate of lending and an increase in how fast debt is repaid, the economy goes into a slump. I'll turn it around by putting it back to the original conditions again. But that's what happened in the financial crisis. And that's how simple it is to illustrate if I work in a monetary model of the economy. And it's possible to do that with modern technology. It wasn't possible 40 years ago, 50 years ago. But it has been possible for literally half a century to do it. So what I'm trying to do is to bring modern, non-equilibrium simulation and analysis methods to economics. Now, why am I doing it at a university like Kingston? Why not Oxford? Why not Cambridge? There we have an ideological lock-in. The economists who dominate those universities do not realise they're ideological. They believe they're logical. But they have a particular way of thinking about the world which their community reinforces. It says it's all about equilibrium, rational expectations as they call it, all the stuff I showed you that led to beforehand. And I'm a heretic. Now, heretics don't get jobs in the church. Okay? They get jobs in the periphery. So you will not get exposed to ideas like this in your courses at Oxford and Cambridge. You may get exposed to them if you join the Rethinking Economics group, which exists in both those universities and invites me to come over and speak. And the staff are never there, the students are. So it's what I'd encourage you to do. Go to Oxford, go to Cambridge, do your degree there, but don't believe what you're being taught. Learn it. Learn alternative ways of thinking about the economy. Don't trust all of those either. Bring scepticism with you. And join the student groups that are trying to bring about change. Because ultimately the biggest problem in any discipline, and it isn't just economics, is that scientists become wedded to a particular view. It's called a paradigm. And if I can recommend one book for you to read, which is one of the most brilliant books ever written about the history and philosophy of science, called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. And it explains how scientists actually believe their paradigm and try to extend it forward. But because no theory is complete, anomalies will build up. Their initial reaction to the anomalies is to try to modify the theory to cope with the anomalies. But then ultimately you get a complete breakdown where something comes along the theory simply can't explain. Ultimately that becomes the total focus of attention in a genuine science. And then somebody comes in with a revolutionary idea that solves that dilemma and science goes forward in a scientific revolution. Economics still needs that revolution. It's fought the revolution off in the time of Keynes. It's fighting it off now. But ultimately reality should rule. And we do have the technology, the concepts to handle the elements that economic theory, mainstream economic theory, leaves out because they regard them as too difficult or too false, etc., etc. So the technologies are there to handle the economy in a much more realistic representation of how it operates than what you will learn at the mainstream universities. And I encourage you to be skeptics when you go to Oxford and Cambridge. Thank you.
We have some time for questions if you would like to ask one.
Yeah.
Do dynamic models offer the ability to implement behavioural economics?
Oh, absolutely. But one of the problems with behavioural economics is that I went to a seminar on behavioural economics just recently, which brought together mainstream economists and people working in behavioural economics. And a lot of behavioural economists still take as their reference point the neoclassical definition of rational behaviour. Now, the neoclassical definition of rational behaviour, in my opinion, is the definition of the capacity for accurate prophecy. If you think that's rational, you're working from entirely the wrong standpoint. But what happens is behavioural economists will talk about biases, fast versus slow learning, etc., etc. There's so many deviations from rationality found by those experiments that the reaction of mainstream economists is to say, it's all too difficult, let's just assume rational behaviour. So they don't actually operationalise those models. Where it's turning up is in multi-agent modelling. And there's a lot of interesting technology in multi-agent modelling. By the way, my Minsky software is free, downloadable from SourceForge. Please go and get a copy if you want to have a play of what I was showing you a moment ago. But there's also, in multi-agent modelling, another free program called NetLogo. And a brilliant PhD student of mine just did a marvellous model of the evolution of markets using NetLogo. So these software packages, elements like it, are being used by the Bank of England, for example, to model behaviour. And you can put in those so-called deviations from rationality in the individual agents. The trouble is the overload of having to code is so enormous, and the complexity of what comes out is so hard to interpret that often you don't get particular worthwhile conclusions out of it. You get caught in a miasma of alternative models which might depend upon the peculiar assumptions you've made rather than the actual structure. So I'm not a critic. I have two students of mine doing PhDs on multi-agent modelling, so I'm not anti by any means. But I think what we're doing again in economics is believing we should work everything out from the individual up. Now, if you look at genuine sciences, things like thermodynamics and so on, they began with collective equations that describe an entire amalgam of systems. Like the original equations for thermodynamics describe a thermodynamic equilibrium in a room, for example, okay, with a set of a limited set of equations. Only when you get to the stage of having to model extreme nonlinearity events does it make worth your while to model each individual molecule bouncing off the others and bouncing off the wall sometimes and giving you deviations from that thermodynamical equilibrium. So genuine sciences tend to work in the aggregate level and work down. And that's what I think we should do initially. I think it's diving in at the wrong end to go straight to multi-agent. But it is worthwhile work to learn about, and I'd rather see not as deviations of rationality, but actual rational behaviour. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
How do you think the field of economics will change if it accepts that markets end up in this equilibrium?
I have a bad hearing. Can you repeat more slowly, pardon me?
How do you think the field of economics will change and develop if it
they'll go back to the same old way of thinking, and they're already doing it. So I'll see if I can find one of the most recent papers I've seen on this front. I'll be pushing my luck to find it while I'm on stage here, so I'll just mention it. A paper coming out in 2018 concluded there's nothing wrong with economics, nothing needs to be changed, everything is fine. We have a dialogue, we have a way of talking to each other called DSGE models, and all we need to do is add the right shocks and frictions to this model to fit the data. Now, what they're accepting is that the economy is an equilibrium system which is only disturbed from equilibrium by shocks, and the return to equilibrium is slowed down by frictions. They're not questioning that innate paradigm of a system which is inherently stable. So if left to their own devices, what they will do is go back and focus on microeconomics until your macro doesn't really matter. Only a few of us do macro, and let's protect the micro. And then when they think it's safe, they'll come out again and start doing the same old macro again. And I've literally seen that happening already. So I don't think we can rely upon them. I think you need to disturb them. And that's why I'm a great fan of the Rethinking Economics movement. And I would like to bring as many people in from other disciplines into economics. I'm encouraging engineers to come in, people who work in thermodynamics, biologists who use mathematical techniques like I've shown you here to model biological systems. I want them to come in because they are not wedded to this ridiculous idea that capitalism is great because it reaches equilibrium. Hayek and Keynes, in this sense, overlapped. Hayek believed that capitalism is great because it handles disequilibrium. So I'd rather have that foundation than what the mainstream economists have got themselves. Yeah.
Have you only worked in machine learning?
Yes. Yeah. I have a lot of time for them, but I was pointing out over dinner, one problem is that the data you put to the neural network is what it fits. Now, if you have a presupposition that something doesn't matter, shouldn't be in there, you train the neural network to fit the data based on inputs which are not the complete system. So you're still caught with that problem. You have to get the complete system there. So I work with 2 or 3 colleagues building neural network systems. And you know how good they are with language these days. I mean, it used to be, if you wanted to have a bit of a joke on a Friday night, you could auto-translate text from French to German and back again and see how crazy it was. These days, sometimes you think, I don't know which was the original. So they have improved because language has got that consistency to it, and you can learn from enormous numbers of instances and develop a system which can do very decent translation. But with economics, you've got to get the inputs right in the first place. And if you don't have, in my opinion, credit inside the system, you're going to be wrong. So they're not a complete solution. Yeah.
You mentioned how the universities like Oxford and Cambridge have sort of a monolithic view of neoclassical economics, and they aren't really willing to body that. Do you think that leading universities are resistant to changes in economic theory because they are so close to making government policy and sort of like close to political structures? So for instance, like,
funnily enough, the closer you get to the political structure now, the less dominant neoclassical economics is, because just think about what happens when you are actually dealing with politicians. You have somebody who doesn't know what technology is that derived the set of numbers they're looking at or set of graphs, takes your word for granted, and gets told that 2008 is going to be a fabulous year. Get out there and take the credit for the tremendous performance of the economy, falling inflation, falling unemployment, everything reaching stability, and you walk out and Lehman Brothers collapses. You smile, you evade the journalist questions as best you can, which of course as a politician you're an expert at giving non-answers. Okay? You walk out the room and you go, where is that economist? And bash the hell out of them. And that's what happened to a large degree to economists inside the Bank of England and the Treasury to some extent, more so the Bank of England. And they came out saying, we got it wrong. Our models did not give us any warning whatsoever. We have to be open to more varied ways of thinking about the economy. So the Bank of England began what's called the one bank policy, and they hire people from all sorts of walks of life, physicists, chemists, engineers, as well as economists to work on economic problems. Whereas in places like the universities, they can say somebody else's problem, exogenous shock, bad policy, etc., and continue teaching as if the crisis didn't occur. And you will find if you join, and I really strongly encourage you to join the Rethinking Economics groups at the universities you go to. If there isn't one there, then found it. you will find that that's the reaction those students had. They came, this is in Manchester in particular, it began in the UK. Students at Manchester turning up in 2009 thought they'd be learning about what caused the financial crisis. Nothing was mentioned. They approached one of the staff, a good friend of mine, Devram Yilmaz, asking him to put on a course on alternative economic theories. He was actually asked by the head of department to do it. He did. It was turned down after he put the course together. The students asked him to teach it after hours, which he did, and his contract wasn't renewed the next year. So they drove out a potential source of alternative thought. I hired him, of course. This is the problem, that there's a sense in which economics is like a religion. And if the Catholics dominate comparative religions, all you hear about is Catholic religion. In that sense, they don't want to hear about alternative approaches. So in that sense, the policy areas are actually more realistic than the ones that are further away. My real danger is things like PPE. Pardon me, anybody trying to do PPE. A little bit of danger, one of the classic statements is a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. You know, you can learn a model that looks at first year economics like it's neat, it's plausible, and it's right. The trouble is it can be neat, plausible, and wrong. And you've got to dive deeply into the literature to see why it is wrong, which is why I wrote Debunking Economics. So again, I'm just encouraging you to be sceptical. If something doesn't feel right to you in a textbook, it's probably wrong. It's not your failing to understand. It's the theory is built on an edifice like the ones I showed you from those quotes beforehand, which is nonsense. So, complicated answer, but I think the policy areas like the OECD, the Bank of England, the Bundesbank, I think they're more likely to bring about new economics than the university departments are. Yeah.
You talked about countries avoiding financial crises such as...
Well, am I hearing again? Sorry, yeah?
You talked about countries avoiding financial crises such as China and Australia.
Yeah.
How long did it take even before the experience of financial crisis? You talked about how important they were.
I think Tuesday. Australia's going through it right now. Their housing bubble's falling over. And it's actually a very interesting case study. Search what's called the Banking Royal Commission in Australia, and you'll find that the banking sector has been investigated by a Royal Commission and finding an outrageous level of fraudulent behaviour right across the financial sector. And because of that, the banks have now stopped lending to virtually everybody. So the credit is plunging in Australia very rapidly. Too fast even in some ways to find in the data, because the data is quarterly or monthly for debt data. It takes a while before we see the results. But there's a huge plunge in credit. With that plunge in credit, demand is falling. And with that demand falling, the economy will start falling over as well. And the timing is always that the property market goes first, or the asset markets go first, because they're susceptible to the acceleration of debt, not the change, not the level, but the acceleration. And that's the first thing to turn. So that's happening in the Australian economy right now. Canada's having a similar syndrome. China is probably going through it as well, but the Chinese data is masked so heavily by gigantic levels of government spending already that it's hard to find just that credit effect, but it is definitely hitting that country as well. So my four major nominations for a crisis in the next 1 to 3 years are Australia, Canada, France, and possibly Korea. But countries like the UK, you've already had your crisis, and the way I describe the UK, the USA, Portugal and Spain is the walking dead of debt. So you're in the aftermath, and the same way Japan was. I'll just show you the Japanese data. If I bring that up, I haven't shown Japan so far. Now, if we'd learned from history, we would have learned from Japan, because it was the first country to have a financial crisis. And I'll just use the arrow. Wrong arrow key. There's Japan. Now you can see they had a huge private debt bubble right back in the 1990s, and then it plunged to negative, like dramatic drops, and now they've now got much the same debt level that the UK and the USA have now. But they went from credit being almost 30% of GDP at the peak of their boom to about minus 10% in the 1990s, and they've been in the doldrums for all that period of time. They're only coming out of it now after debt has fallen from 220% of GDP to 155%. Now your UK is still running at 170%. This is private debt, not government debt. So they're still mired in like a ball and chain of excessive debt around spending, and consequently you don't get much investment, you don't get much consumer demand coming out of credit. And for that reason, the economy remains in the doldrums. And you can be there, as Japan has, for 25 years. Yeah.
If credit, which by definition is changing over price,
Yeah.
is what drives us into crises, but there is a level of debt which is too high.
Yeah.
What's the solution? If you don't find a solution to avoid a crisis, continue credit, continue positive credit, but you're building up your level of absolute debt.
Exactly. Yeah.
What's
The only solution is to abolish the debt, to write it off. I proposed this about 6 or 7 years ago, what I call a modern debt jubilee. Any classical scholars here learning Latin or Greek history? My God, okay. I was hoping there'd be at least one. There's a tradition right from the days of the Sumerian Empire for regular jubilees where all debt would be written off. And they actually happened originally because the Sumerian army was an army of freemen. You couldn't be a slave and be in the army. But because people were falling into debt slavery, the number of potential members of the army was declining and the empire was a threat. So the empire decided to do the simple thing and execute the money lenders. Now, ultimately it became systematized, and every 50 years or every change of ruler, then all debt would be written off. Debt slaves would be liberated, they could go back to their land and so on. And you got a reset on a regular basis. And there's a strong argument that the fall of the Roman democracy was because of the revolt by the landlords against that happening, leading to the breakdown of the republic and the rise of the empire. We think we're so smart we don't need to do it anymore. But I think we do. We need regular debt write-offs, but not in a way that benefits anybody who speculates over somebody who did not. So what I propose is a regular modern debt jubilee, using the government's capacity to create money to pay it to people on a per capita basis. Those with debt either get their debt reduced or get an offset account against their debt, so they can't actually spend. Those without debt get a cash injection, which could be used for buying shares, democratising share ownership. It could be used for stimulus, something of that nature. Because to me, the main problem is exactly the one you identified. You get a boom coming out of a high level of credit, but because of that boom, which stimulates the economy, you also accumulate the debt. And then finally you get to a point where there's so much debt, banks won't lend anymore, people don't want to borrow, the credit-based demand disappears and you go into a slump. So recognising that's part of what we actually live in, the part of the system, what can we compensate with? And we can compensate with the government's capacity to create money, as we've seen through QE. So you all know of QE. The British, the Bank of England has been creating £200 billion worth of spending power every year since the crisis began. They're slowing down doing it now, but $200 billion a year. Did anybody here pay a QE tax, or your parents pay a QE tax? They didn't, did they? So it wasn't financed by taxes. The government's got exactly the same capacity to create money that a private bank has, but the difference is when a private bank creates money for you, it also creates a matching amount of debt. So there's no net increase in your position. You might make yourself look better by speculating on assets, but you don't have any increase in money. But if the government creates money, it doesn't come with an additional debt obligation for you. It comes with one for them, but not for you. So the government's capacity to create money could actually offset and cancel that private debt. I think it's politically got zero feasibility, but that would work. Sorry, pardon me?
Isn't that potentially rational hyperinflation?
It's potentially that, which is one reason I propose that we should actually limit, one way to completely eliminate the inflationary side is to say, if you are somebody who hasn't borrowed money and therefore get a cash injection, you can only use that cash injection to buy shares, and the shares must be used by the company to cancel their private debt, corporate debt, because as it happens in the UK, corporate debt and household debt are much at the same level. They're roughly about 85% of GDP. So your corporations have too much debt as well as your households. If you did this, the corporations you would get the money to pay down debt of, indebted households would get them the debt paid down, or reduced in effective burden terms. Non-indebted households would get a cash injection with which they could buy shares. The shares would be used to reduce corporate debt. And what you'd have is a spreading of share ownership through the population. Whereas at the moment, what QE has done is benefit people who own shares. So there's been a massive increase in inequality out of actual QE. My idea would actually eliminate that inequality And it could be zero inflationary because you could actually use it just to reduce debt levels with no money going into the real economy. But I'd want to test it. I would never do anything like that without saying, let's try a small sample and see what happens first. Yeah.
How do you think new technologies?
Sorry?
How do you think the new technologies such as artificial intelligence and blockchain and other things, not just changing from theory, but actually the structure of economics, not just understanding the
Yeah, I'm a critic of Bitcoin, and the reason I am is because the people who invented Bitcoin developed a marvelous solution for a problem that doesn't exist. And that is, they really thought the problem with banking was you couldn't trust the bank's accounting. Now, with one major exception that I know of, which is the Commonwealth Bank in Australia, you can trust the accounting. The Commonwealth Bank actually lost decades, I think it was decades, of financial information literally off the back of a truck. They sent tapes off to be stored somewhere, the tapes never arrived. One wonders about why. But generally speaking, bank ledgers are trustworthy. It isn't the ledgers that are untrustworthy, it's the lending practices. And it's the creation of money by banks for speculative reasons rather than genuine investment. That's the problem. So Bitcoin addresses a problem that doesn't exist. And it's based on an analogy to gold in the belief that gold is money. But you ask any Bitcoiner, that's pretty much what they'll say. But if you look historically, there's a wonderful pair of books by two friends of mine. One a long-term friend, the other I met a couple of days ago. David Graeber wrote a book called Debt the First 5,000 Years. Marvellous anthropologist's historical account of the evolution of money over time. And they went looking for the myth of barter, the Adam Smith dogs trucking and barter stuff, or humans trucking and barter in the way the dogs don't do. And they couldn't find any historical examples of barter. What they found instead was most exchanges were customary, and custom evolved into credit. So credit was the initial form of money. And then money evolved out of credit, not out of barter. So the proper understanding of money is that it's not a commodity like gold, but Bitcoin has been based on an analogy as if it is gold. And then even on top of that, do you know how you make gold? Simple. Take two neutron stars, smash them into each other, and catch the detritus. That's how gold's created as an element. So it's rather hard to make gold. There's only a certain amount on any particular planet you care to find. Whereas there are about over 200 cryptocurrencies. So it's based on an analogy to say there's a fixed amount. But in fact, anybody can copy those algorithms and produce a new coin. There's hundreds of different times out there. So it's a false analogy of what money actually was. It solves a problem that didn't actually exist particularly. And it has effects that aren't anything like what it was supposed to be based upon, which is gold in the first place. So I expect Bitcoin to fall back to zero. However, some of the blockchain technology is very useful for other activities. So the one thing about the blockchain, the immutability of it, is one way to, for example, keep records of share transactions in a way that can't be falsified. So I'm actually working with a couple of groups that are trying to bring out a share technology-based system rather than a monetary one using that technology. So I don't think the technology is going to have much impact, except in a centralised basis. Some central banks are talking about electronic currency using a blockchain, or using cryptocurrency, and I said I know a couple of share groups as well. Yeah.
If you encourage governments to create money and write off debt, wouldn't that affect their ability to borrow in the international market? So affecting their sovereign.
If they need to borrow in the international market, it would. And this is a question of, do you need to borrow in the international market to create domestic pounds? Now, you don't need to borrow American dollars to create pounds locally, okay? The government's capacity to create pounds is because it is the government. So you only need to borrow when you actually need foreign currency. And that's if you're running a trade deficit, a country like Argentina, Turkey, and so on. They have to borrow not in their own domestic currency. So then they do have that problem. But fundamentally, this is one little, there's some elements of economics I'd like to abolish completely, and one is the word savings. Because we all think that saving is a good idea. It's great to spend less than you get back in income. So therefore you accumulate. Trouble is, at the national level, income is expenditure. They're identical. Your spending becomes somebody else's income. So if you attempt to save money in that sense, by spending less than you earn, you might do it individually, but your saving becomes somebody else's dissaving, precisely the same amount. I can illustrate that in Minsky too, by the way, with a very simple model. Now what it means is what saving actually amounts to at the aggregate level is slowing down how fast money turns over. Well, one of the advantages of money is that it does turn over. So attempting to achieve savings at the national level actually causes GDP to fall by precisely as much because you're slowing down how fast money circulates. So there's one element where you've got to say somebody has to just save. If you're going to have one group saving, we all want to accumulate more money over time. That's only possible if somebody is negatively accumulating. So you have to ask yourself the question, who in society has the capacity to run up indefinite debt? And the only answer is the government, because they have their own bank. So in that sense, and this is why I agree with modern monetary theory, if the non-government sector wants to accumulate positive financial assets over time, the only way is somebody else is accumulating precisely as much negative. And the only group that can do that in a sustained sense is a government that is not exposed to foreign currency risk. Now, the UK is moderately exposed to foreign currency risk, not as badly as Argentina, for example. So it can get away with it for a long, long time. And what you should be doing is using that to encourage circulation of money and encourage investment, which the UK has been drastically bad at doing.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Yeah.
So you're saying that rising credit as part of debt is the main driver for growth in the economy, and you're sort of doing away with the rational expectations model.
Yeah.
So you say that consumers are rational. Wouldn't it be likely that they'd invest quite a bit of that credit in unproductive assets like housing, which would eventually lead to what was a great?
By saying that I reject the rational model, I'm not saying people are irrational. I'm saying you're rational in a sensible way. Okay. But yes, you're quite right. If you didn't have controls on bank lending, then what people do with borrowed money is, you mentioned you're trying to achieve positive equity. One thing I've learned from building Minsky, and I didn't know this before I built the software package itself, is that the sum of all assets and liabilities is zero. If your net worth is your assets minus your liabilities. So if you have a positive net worth, somebody else has got them around the other way with a negative net worth. So the aggregate is zero. Okay? So you have that situation, but you want to have positive equity. So what do? You go to a bank, you borrow money, and you use that money to buy shares or houses. Now, when you value those shares and houses in your portfolio, what you do is let's say your house is worth £1 million, okay? Because that's what the house next door sold for last week, okay, and use the same valuation. We then multiply, and it's like an average for the whole country, we multiply the price of the last house sold for by the entire stock of housing. That gives us a fictional net worth. But if we all tried to realise those prices, you wouldn't sell your house for $1 million, you'd sell it for nothing. So it's an illusory, but see, the price, we value the level of assets by the price of assets, which is the current trading price, multiplied by the outstanding stock. Okay? The outstanding stock might be, say, 10 million homes. Now, how many homes actually sell every year? Might be 500,000. If you actually tried to get to anything like the scale of the valuation we give to those assets, you'd flood the market and the prices would crash. So you have to say that's the tendency we all have in capitalism, to want to have positive equity. We can't have it. We do it in an illusory way through the asset markets, and the banks finance us in doing it. So what you have to do is you have to have controls on bank lending. We have to stop treating bank debt as sacrosanct, which we do right now, as if it's all the borrower's fault for getting in trouble. And the banks never lend irresponsibly. And they always lend for sensible projects, all of which is total myth. The Australian government is finding that in a big way right now, with all the documentation falling out about the outright fraud the banking sector has been doing, because the capacity to create money must be the greatest temptation on the planet. And if you are profiting by creating debt and charging a fee for that charging service every time, you want to create as much debt as you can. So we have to recognise that and say banking is a very special industry, unlike any other, where you create something effectively out of nothing. Of course, there are costs in running a bank and so on, but you don't have to buy goods and services like you have to buy to build this machine. You've got to buy bits and pieces of hardware. Okay? That gives you various limitations on what can be created in the computer industry that don't exist in banking, because you create it by double entry bookkeeping. And so the encouragement is always there to create too much debt. So you have to channel and control that power that banks have, which they only have because they've been given a banking license. And a banking license is not just a private right, it's a social responsibility. And what we've ignored is that social responsibility and the belief banks can be trusted to behave responsibly. Look at the last 20 years. Anything but.
Well, we have been very fortunate to have Professor Keynes come and speak to us tonight. His breakdown of how Minsky software can be used to model economies, as well as why we should be wary of classical economics, has been very insightful and interesting. So could you please all join me in thanking him for coming?
Thank you.